The response in Africa to the gradual abolition of the slave trade, in fact, has been labeled a major crisis of adaptation by one historian. He called it a crisis of adaptation because he argued that the trade in human beings, the slave trade, was something remarkably different from what followed it in the 19th century, when other commodities, when actual commodities rather than people, became the major object of trade between Africa and Europe and other parts of the world. And that shift in trade from human beings to goods meant that those goods had to be produced in Africa, and that in itself resulted in major changes in many parts of West Africa in particular. At the time, it was called a shift from the illegal slave trade to what they called at the time legitimate trade. Legitimate meaning legal, as opposed to something now that had been made illegal. And so that in the literature and in the scholarship about the 19th century, there's this curious phrase which is legitimate trade. And just as liberated Africans has remained a term that continues in the literature, even though the Africans were not actually liberated, that's what they were called. So the commodities that were produced as legitimate trade items were in fact in many cases actually produced by slaves, but produced by slaves in Africa. And those commodities included, first and foremost, palm oil from palm trees, and second, peanuts, which in the British English are referred to as groundnuts, and in French as arachide. But those two commodities were the major so-called legitimate goods. Others there were different types of woods, different types of dyes, a whole bunch of other commodities too. Now, palm oil was used in the 19th century for several purposes. In West Africa, it was a cooking oil, and it was the major oil that people used. The palm tree was a very valuable item locally, just because of its agricultural dimensions. But what palm oil was used for in Europe in the 19th century was basically as a lubricant. It was before the real discovery of petroleum products. Once petroleum became important, it very quickly replaced palm oil as a way of lubricating machines, and so that was a major change. As the 19th century went on, palm oil was also used, as it was in West Africa, as the basis to make soap. And indeed, palm olive, the name of one of the soaps, gets its name from palm oil. And so that palm oil, when it's processed into a soap, is a very good soap because it really does do a good job of cleaning. As a lubricant, the thing about palm oil is it's really, really, really greasy, and that's why it's such a good lubricant on machines. It's not as good as petroleum, but nonetheless, for approximately 100 years, it was a major industrial ingredient that helped to run the increasing numbers of machines in factories in Europe and indeed in North America. So the shift resulted in those areas where palm oil actually grew, which was near the coast in West Africa, because it's a tree crop that grows in the tropics, not in the savanna, not in the interior. the areas around in the coast area, in the Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Benin, and Ashanti, Sierra Leone, all areas that had been very heavy sources of enslaved Africans now became sources of palm oil that was taken to the coast and shipped to Europe. And in many cases, the palm oil depended upon the use of slave labor locally, also family labor in the harvesting and in the processing, and especially in the transport of the oil to shipping points on the coast. Peanuts had a similar function. The peanuts also, the oil in the peanut can also be used to make soap, and it became a major source in producing soaps at the same time that palm oil did. And of course, the increasing use of soap means that in some ways people were dirtier in Europe than they had been for a long, long time. And one of the reasons they were dirtier is they were working in factories. And and they were living in cities more and more. The cities were being heated by coal, and the coal is dirty, as we know. And so the need for soap increased dramatically in the 19th century. Something that we take for granted now is not very significant in even thinking about it. But in the 19th century, it was an extremely important ingredient. So that change and that shift from the export of human beings to the export of these commodities has been called this crisis of adaptation. It required the adjustments of local economies to a new type of economy, which in effect was much more modern because it was not based on the sale of human beings, even though slaves were continued to be used in Africa in considerable numbers. So our readings for this week are going to involve the biography, the autobiography of Muhammad Ali Said. He was an individual who came from the interior of West Africa, from Borno specifically, in the context of the jihad movement. And the jihad movement, of course, continued as the adjustment to the abolition of the slave trade in the Atlantic was underway, and the development of legitimate trade. In Said's case, he was taken across the Sahara as a slave, not taken to the Atlantic. And so our purpose really of looking at his account is twofold. First, we want to demonstrate that the slave trade continued even as the British attempted to abolish the slave trade, and the shift of legitimate trade, that is the trade in goods other than slaves, was well underway, so that we still see a continuation of the slave trade. And second, because it's important to recognize that the connections with North Africa were always important, and this allows us to examine what happened to Said as he was taken to Tripoli in what's now Libya, and then taken to the Ottoman Empire, and ultimately, as we will see, ending up in Russia, then traveling throughout Europe, and finally ending up in North America, including Canada, and fighting in the American Civil War as a sergeant in the Union Army. And even though he was never taken to North America or to the Americas as a slave, he nonetheless, once he had gained his freedom, he chose to stay in North America and to fight to liberate others who were enslaved in the United States. And his unusual story, taking him across the Sahara to Russia and ultimately to North America, provides another perspective on what happened to the enslaved Africans in the 19th century.